Boatworks today is sponsored by Total Boat and Alexial Yacht Coatings, as well as supported by the generosity from the beautiful folks over on Patreon. Thank you so much. It's been a while. See if I still remember how to do this. So, welcome back, everybody. Hope you are all having a fantastic weekend and happy holidays. Happy New Year. It's been a couple weeks. My name is Andy with Boatworks today, and this week we're getting back on the transom of this Bertram. Now, before I go too far down this rabbit hole, I want to do just a real quick overview, partly to bring you guys up to speed, but also to help myself remember, quite honestly, where I left things off, because it's been quite a few months since I've even looked at this. So, let me turn the camera around. Let's see where we're at. Now, this is a 1972 Bertram Moppy 25, and originally when these boats were designed, they were designed to have twin board engines. The previous owner, at least the person that was working on this boat before I took ownership of it, had started the conversion going from twin inboards into twin outboards. And he's put on an Armstrong bracket, and they did some work on the transom, but they didn't really do a whole lot in the way of actually reinforcing the transom. Now, seeing that this boat was originally designed for twin inboards, it really, untouched, or I should say without any kind of modification or upgrades, as it is, it really wasn't really designed to accommodate the stresses of having an outboards. I mean, you're going to have, what, 500-600 pounds hanging 2.5 feet up off the back and basically attached to the boat by a bracket or a few mounting points. So there's a lot more stresses that's going to be much more focused on certain areas of the transom rather than being spread out over the entire transom. So what I'm trying to do now, I've got some limitations on what I can and cannot do, just because of the shape and the geometry of this transom. But overall, what I'm trying to do then is the best I can. I'm trying to basically spread out the load of these mounting points of the Armstrong bracket to as large of an area as I can. Now, the mounting brackets for this Armstrong bracket, they run in a straight line coming from here all the way across and over to that other side of the wing there. Now, just because of the shape of this, as it is right now, I'm still trying to figure this one out. I can't quite extend any material up into here, at least not yet. We'll see what happens here. Or really further down, just because it gets real wonky. So what I think I'm going to end up having to do then is I'm going to have to approach this in stages, right? So right now, this is the first piece that I have cut. This is something that I had in place back in Wisconsin. Now, obviously, it's still floating. It's not mounted, but I need to kind of do some work behind this piece before this can actually go down. Because again, seeing that this transom wasn't really designed to have really any material extend beyond what was original, so like right in through here, this is where the original transom coring material was. So, it's not a whole lot that I'm adding to it, but I am adding about another foot on the beam, on both the port and starboard side, as well as extending it up about another foot. So it's the best that I can do. It's the best that this design allows me to do. So with that said, let me get this piece out of place, and then I haven't looked behind here in 6 months, so I'm not quite sure what's going to await me. So here is where things are at. Now, in the center here, this is already Coosa that I have already mounted. I believe this is total of 1.5 inches thick. Now, this main part of the panel here, this was the easy part, because the back side of this transom in that area right there, that was actually all dead flat. So these were flat panels. I could just cut them to fit, paste them in there with epoxy, and we were good to go. Now, I went with 1.5 inch thick material primarily because that was going to give me basically a flush surface along the top here. So it's going to be easy for me to extend the third piece of Coosa up onto this top, but that didn't really do me a whole lot of good along the sides. Now, this is where things kind of get tricky. I've got low spots in through here, and I believe the reason that I've added some glass here was to try and build this up a little bit, to try and get a little bit of a uniform curvature. It's still not there yet, I can tell just by looking at it. Now, once you get down towards the bottom here, this is where it gets really, really interesting, because here's a low spot right here, and to try and get this surface to curve in onto this, there's probably 1.5 inches, difference in thickness or elevation, height, however you want to coin that. But so I'm trying to figure this area out, but I think that was the main logic for cutting that third section that I just removed the way that I did, so that the wings on that third section are just going to extend across from side to side there, which that's fine. I think that'll be fine. That's where all the mounting bolts for the swim platform are anyways. Not a whole lot's going to be needed down the corners. If push comes to shove and I'm kind of questioning it, I'm going to have to extend these stringers anyways. So after all of the material is on here and I've got the total thickness that I'm looking for, I can always beef up these stringers as they butt up to the transom anyways. But I will say my end goal, when I'm actually at the point where I'm laying up my last and final, I guess, layer of Coosa, is that I want that piece to be as large as possible. So, you know, if that means I got to do a little bit of jigsaw work in here, jigsaw puzzle work, to try and build it up and get a uniform curvature, so be it. Now, at this point, I don't know how the hell that's going to happen, but, you know, we're going to take it one thing at a time, baby steps. So first things first. So I've gotten the surface basically knocked down, any of the high ridges from when I was laying up the glass. That's all smoothed over now. And then I also came in with a little belt sander and rounded over any kind of hard edges. Now, the surface as it is right now is far from where it needs to be. Right? I mean, if I were to try and lay up that piece of Coosa right over top of this now, I would have a ton of voids, specifically right in this general area here, and that's not really where I want to have some voids. So I need to figure out a way to, I guess, see where I'm low, right? And to do that, I just made a simple little jig right here. Now this is nothing fancy. I'm sure there are fancier ways to try and do this, but I am a very strong proponent of the KISS theory. You know, just basically try and keep everything as stupid simple as you can, right? So 1/4 inch hardboard onto a just, you know, whatever, some kind of a dowel. Now, ironically enough, the stiffness of this 1/4 inch piece of hardboard it's about the same as 1/2 inch Coosa. So if this thing can make the curvature of where, you know, what the Coosa needs to do, in theory, the Coosa should be able to do it as well. Now, the way I'm going to be using this is I'm going to take this and span the trouble areas. Now, looking at it here, there's a little bit of a gap along the top. As I work my way down, then a little bit of a gap becomes a little bit more pronounced. All right, so I got the 2 corners marked out here, and it's pretty much what I was anticipating. So here, looking at the starboard corner here, essentially, I went through and I outlined kind of where the edge of my fill needs to end. And it's really not that large of an area. It's maybe 14 by 16, give or take. Now, I also came back and right down the middle here, I drew a line, just kind of a little squiggly line. That's marking where the lowest area of this span. So along that zagged or ziggity zag, whatever line, that's where it's going to need the most fill. And then as you work out towards the edges here, it eventually tapers off to not needing anything. Now, along that center strip where it's most low, that needs about 1/4 inch of build. And it's pretty consistent on both sides. Now that's the starboard side. Here is the port side. Slightly larger area, and the low spot is actually running a little bit more diagonal on the side for whatever reason. So it's going to be the same concept. Again, you know, along that center line, marking the lowest points, that's going to need about 1/4 inch of build, and then as you work out towards the edges, it's eventually not going to need anything. Now, there's a couple different ways that I can approach this, and I'm pretty sure I know how I want to do it, but I'm gonna sit and think on it for just a little bit. I've got about a foot and a half of snow that I need to move outside the house and the shop before it gets dark. So I'm gonna put on my thinking cap, go push some snow around, and then come back and then make a decision on how it is I want to approach this. We're just gonna give her. So good morning. Now, as I mentioned last night, I have a couple different directions I could go as far as trying to build up the low spots on this transom. The first and obvious one, I think, would be to just actually build it up with some glass. We're looking at about a 1/4 inch thickness in the thickest, or I should say in the lowest part. That would come out to about 6, maybe 7 layers of 1708. And that would be a great option. Now, the direction that I'm actually going to be going, and that I'm going to be taking, is going to be using some thickened epoxy. Now, that will work great, providing it is the correct type of thickened epoxy. Now, as we all know, let's just kind of break it down into 2 basic categories here. We've got like structural epoxy mixes, and then we've got like fairing epoxy mixes, like your Total Fair. In a nutshell, the differences between those two, one is going to be softer, such as like the Total Fair, which is great for fairing, which also makes it easy for sanding. The other, structural, which is what we're going to be doing here, it's going to be better as far as like compressive qualities. It's just going to have more bulk, more strength to it. And the downside, which works great, but the downside of that is it's a little bit of a bear to sand. Now, I'm going to be mixing up my own epoxy here and thickening it up. And for doing that, I'm going to be using 2 different additives here. The first one is going to be using silica or Cabasil. They're both the exact same thing. They're just called different names. I think it might be a trade name kind of a deal. I'm not sure. But I'm going to be using some silica. What that's going to do is that's going to give us the body. That's going to keep it from sagging and running down on us. So that's going to be the thickening agent. And then for the actual strength, I'm going to be using some milled glass fibers. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be using epoxy here, but that is certainly not the only option. You could also use a polyester-based material, such as like a structural repair putty, which is essentially what we're going to be mixing up here, just its base component is polyester resin instead of epoxy. It's still going to have the milled glass fibers in it, as well as the silica for the thickening. Now, my main reason for going with epoxy is just because I want that longer working time. When you start working with larger batches of, say, polyester material, even though I keep it fairly cool in here, when you're mixing up sizable batches, the working time that you have can become very, very limited. So, because I don't know how long this is going to take, I would probably be fine using polyester either way. But because I'm going to be mixing up, I think, a fairly large batch, it's going to be 24 ounces, so 16 and then 8. So I'm going to be mixing up a 24-ounce batch and then add the thickener onto that. And I think that's going to be enough to cover both areas. But being it's going to be epoxy, and specifically because I'm using their slow hardener, that's going to give me a lot longer working time than it would be if I were to be doing the same process using a polyester-based material. So that's my justification there. If polyester-based material is all you happen to have on hand, again, that will work perfectly fine. What I would recommend there is you mix up smaller batches. So that, let's just say you mix up an 8-ounce batch, you want to be able to take that batch and get it onto the surface, spread out, within a few minutes. Whereas with this, I'm going to have 10, maybe 15 minutes of working time. But again, if you're going to be going back to polyester, instead of doing one larger mix, look at doing 2, 3, maybe even 4 smaller mixes so that you can get it mixed and applied onto the surface, quickly. Once that's up, come back, mix up your next batch, and just kind of repeat that process until you got everything, covered the way that you need to have it covered. So, with that said, let me put on my mask, and I'm going to mix up 16 ounces of the resin, or the base, and then 8 ounces of the slow hardener. And then to that, the first additive I'm going to mix in is going to be the milled glass fibers. I'm going to be looking for, it's going to end up being a loose paste consistency. I want to make sure that I've got plenty of glass in there to give me the strength that I'm looking for. The glass fibers themselves are not going to really thicken the mixture at all. That's where the silica is going to come in. So I want to make sure I get my glass in first, and then once I feel I've got enough of that into the mix, then I'll go ahead and add my silica. I'm going to be looking to get this up to a fairly stiff, kind of a peanut butter consistency. All right. So when I was mixing it up, it took a lot of silica to actually get it to the thickness that I was looking for. And to be quite honest, I could have used more, but I could feel the bottom of the pot was starting to get warm just because there's a lot of volume in there. The more volume you have in a container, the faster it's going to start to set up. So it was starting to get warm, so I basically had to cross my fingers and hope that it's going to work out just fine. I am going to have to babysit this for probably the next half hour or so because I'm already starting to see some sagging. So I'll just, when it starts to sag down, I'll give it a quick little push back up into place. And yeah, until it starts to actually tack up, which I'm thinking again is probably going to be about a half hour or so. Anything else? No. Okay. Oh yeah. So, so when it was starting to get warm, I knew my working time was going to be getting short. So at that point then, I dumped out what I didn't need right away. I dumped that out onto a flat surface here and spread it out. The more you can thin it out, I got snowmobiles buzzing around. The more you can thin it out, that's going to slow down that curing process. So by doing that, that bought me a little extra time that I needed to get both sides coated. And so right now, it's just a babysitting game. When everything starts to set up, I'll check back and show you how everything's looking. Yep. I definitely could have used more silica. So I sat around and babysat this thing for 45 minutes, maybe upwards of an hour. And when I decided to leave, it was at the point where it really wasn't moving. I mean, it seemed like it was set, right? So I took off for a couple hours, went down to the house and started doing some editing. And well, came back 2 hours later, and this is kind of how it decided to backfire on me. So I can't say that it ran on me, but it definitely sagged on me. You can see all these nice little curtains, run right there and basically all along that top there, all in through here and a little bit more in through here. And pretty much the same thing going on over on the starboard side. Gotta say, not exactly how I was hoping the first project of the year would turn out. It's not the end of the world. I mean, I've definitely had worse things happen over the years, but still a little frustrating. Anywho, what this does is this kind of throws a little bit of a wrench in what I was planning to talk about as part of this video, which was going to be some time-saving tips when you're working with epoxy. So now at this point, I have a couple of options ahead of me. The first one being I can try and continue on with what I was intending to do if this had actually stayed put and done what I was hoping it was going to do, and it would allow me to finish off what I was going to talk about for the video, or I can basically cut my losses and just let this stuff cure and have to do some sanding. Now the trade-offs, if I go ahead and do what I was intending to do, it's going to set me up for a ton of sanding tomorrow or on Sunday or Saturday, whatever day. Next time I come back to look at this, it's going to set me up for a lot of sanding. Whereas if I kind of cut my losses now, the sanding's not going to be so bad. So instead what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to split that difference, right? So kind of the point I wanted to make, like I mentioned, was going to be some time-saving tips when you're working with epoxy. Now, let me take a little bit of a step back. Let's just kind of compare that to when you're working with polyester resins. Now, polyester comes with two different varieties. I mean, they've got laminating and then non-laminating or finishing. And the difference between those two being one has wax added, the finishing resin, whereas the other one does not, which would make it a laminating resin. So essentially what that means is that with the laminating resins, you're able to come back a day, a week, whatever amount of time later and just lay new material right up over top of that without having to sand or really do anything, any kind of prep. Now epoxy doesn't really come in those types of varieties. There's epoxy, and then that's just it. It is what it is. Now you can add different additives and fillers and pigments and that kind of thing to it to make it something more, but it doesn't come as a laminating or a non-laminating. Now, with that said, when you're working with epoxy, there is a time window where you can go back over top of it without having to sand. Now, like I said, there's a time window. The main factor there is that when let's just say you lay up some material, and you come back an hour, 2 hours later. If you can still take your fingernail and make an indentation in that material that you just laid up, you're perfectly fine to go right over top of that again with either the same epoxy material or something else, as long as it's epoxy based. You can go right back over top of that without having to sand. Now, if you miss that time window, well, then you're pretty much hosed. I mean, if you can't make a dent in it with your fingernail, you've missed your window of opportunity, and you're looking at having to sand. Now, I know this is going to come up. People will mention something about peel ply. And I've mentioned this once before. I personally am not a fan of peel ply for a few reasons. One, I've never used it. I don't have any kind of a track record with it, so I kind of am a little reluctant or hesitant to use it. But that's probably the least of the three issues that I have with it. The second one being, it's just an added expense as far as materials. And then lastly, it's just more garbage. It's just more waste that you have to deal with and throw away. So I personally, I don't choose to use it. But peel ply would be an option for being able to come back to an epoxy-based layup after you've missed that laminating window. You can peel it off, and then in theory, you can just go right back over top of that without having to sand. Again, it's not my thing, but I know that there are lots of people that do it. I'm just not one of them. Just real quick, I want to jump into the video here, because something I realized while I was doing the editing is if I had actually had some of that peel ply and I put that over top of the epoxy that I just laid up, that probably would have been enough to hold everything in place, and I wouldn't have gotten any of the sags. All right, I'll concede there might be a use for it after all. Back to the video. But this is what I was talking about here. So now let's just look at this beautiful little sag right here. Hopefully the camera will still stay zoomed. But you can see it's not sticky at all. I mean, I can touch it, nothing comes off of my fingers. But yet I can still dive my fingernail in there. This is perfect for laying back up, more epoxy and not having to sand. But the issue I'm having with this is because there's so many sags and they're fairly pronounced. If I were to come back over and try and trowel on another layer, these sags are going to hold the trowel so far out that I'm going to end up laying up a lot more material than what I actually need. To the point where pretty much everything I'd be laying up on the second coat would just end up being sanded off. And I mean, I know there are people that love to sand. I'm not one of them. So I think this is one of those situations where it makes more sense to work smarter and not harder. Yeah, it's a little bit of a bummer that I'm not going to be able to get this laid up and have it, put me a step ahead for tomorrow. But it's not the end of the world. It's at least this way tomorrow I'll be able to spend half an hour sanding and then, move on versus an hour sanding and then having to move back on. So I'm going to save the sandpaper, save my shoulders, and just plan on and just save time. So unfortunately, on that note, I think this is going to be the best place to end this video. Now, it's certainly not what I was hoping for, but it is what it is. So at least I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it fun, a little bit of enjoyment in my misfortune. And if you did, hit that thumbs up button. I appreciate it. I could use that right about now. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We're back on schedule now. New videos every Sunday morning on YouTube, a little bit earlier over on Patreon. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave those down below. I'll do my best to get back with you. And as always, I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next Sunday.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.